Good morning, this is the operator. Your call is scheduled to begin momentarily. Until that time, your lines will again be placed on music hold. Thank you for your patience.
Kathryn Kelly. A little bit about her. Kathryn is a former newsreader, writer, and duty editor for IRN LBC in London, and a former producer at ITN. Kathryn continues today to work as both a writer and broadcaster, and runs her own consultancy specializing in PR and media training in crisis comms, with clients all over the UK and Europe. You can learn more about her by visiting www.kathrynkellyprandmedia.co.uk. We have more information on her here on this very slide, her LinkedIn profile and her website, so you can have a look. Before I hand it over to Kathryn, let me first discuss why we decided to choose this topic for the webinar. As content manager at Viewleo, I'm always on the lookout for good and bad PR stories to report. And I find that social media is where I start out every day. Why? Because it's all there. It's all happening every day. From simple complaints, botched Q&As to social media storms, every day some brand, big or small, gets mentioned on the dreaded hashtag #BRFail, or worse still, starts trending on networking platforms, often for the wrong reasons. This is because in the age of social media, there really is no escape, and there is no such thing as a small crisis. I did some research around this, and I found that as many as 84% of companies understand the importance of having a crisis management plan, but surprisingly, as many as half of those companies do not have a plan in place. This is probably, I feel this way, this is probably because the term crisis comms is a bit scary. We automatically think big brands, big disasters, when things go drastically wrong. But social media has changed that, and it has bridged that gap. PRs, unfortunately, who are in the first line of defense, have to be prepared to make sure that that single tweet from that disgruntled customer is resolved right there, right then, before it does in fact turn into a Twitter storm or a social media crisis. So I guess the question is, what can you do to identify a crisis? Who's going to respond from your team when the phones start ringing? This is what Kathryn is going to take us through today. Kathryn, welcome.
Thank you, Priyanka. Good morning, everyone. In the social media age, news consumers are participants and producers of content. They drive the agenda. They dramatically speed up the way news is disseminated. Therefore, any crisis on social media can escalate into a full-blown news story around the world within hours of it breaking. The fallout from this, of course, can be devastating, from permanently damaging a brand to embarrassing government. An example of this is the Air France story this week, where executives who just announced massive job losses had their clothes torn and were forced to scale fences after being set upon by striking workers. Mindful of the rising groundswell of opinion, could the company have done more to avert this? Could they perhaps have changed the venue? Could they perhaps have changed the timing of the announcement? These pictures, of course, were trending of the striking workforce before the announcement was made. So this is a particularly damaging, difficult story with long-term implications for that company. So how do we identify a crisis? First, of course, you need to be aware of the trends on social media. Is there a spike in comments coming from your customers? Can you deal with it with a well-structured response within a couple of exchanges? Or does this look like an issue that's likely to spiral out of control? Often, if we're talking about exchanges on Facebook, for example, you can't resolve it within two exchanges between you and whoever's making the comments about your company. It's probably better to take it out of the social media arena, out of the arena altogether, in fact, and to deal with this privately and try and deal with it away from that particular forum. Monitor your competitors. What are they saying about you? Can you deal with this? Can you nip the comments that are adverse and are growing in the bud? Watch what your staff are saying. Are there tweets coming out which you're not on top of, which you're not controlling? An example of this is from the KitchenAid company in the United States, where an employer used the company's Twitter feed to post a negative comment about President Obama. It transpired that the employee hadn't intended to put their comments onto the company's main Twitter feed, but that's where it gone. But procedures were tightened, the company acted quickly, and the social media crisis was averted. Plan for potentially explosive product launches, controversial announcements such as the Air France one. I once led a team training European sales directors from an international pharmaceutical company in how to deal with difficulties they were expecting on the launch of an animal feed product containing arsenic, which actually is a naturally occurring substance. By rehearsing the scientific arguments, a crisis was averted. So how do we deal with those steps to manage a crisis once it started to unfold and you find yourself in the middle of it? Well, of course, preparation is vital. Every company, no matter what its size, needs an emergency plan tailored to that particular organization. The worst case scenario should be imagined, no matter how overdramatic that might seem, whether it's a gunman on the rampage in a shopping center or a chemical explosion. I've dealt with both of those scenarios in my training. Fire and accidents happen all the time, and how they are dealt with can make the difference between the life and death of a company. To survive a crisis, companies should build a strong relationship with their customers before trouble strikes. They should engage with stakeholders, take legal advice, work with a media consultant, and prepare those key statements. Work out the practicalities. Where and when are the people who are going to be dealing with the crisis? Where are they going to go? How are they going to speak? What's the backdrop? What's the scenario? Effective monitoring should be established 7 days a week if possible. Is there an out-of-hours service that you could use? Senior managers should be aware of negative reports as soon as they start to surface on social media and delegate so that they are dealt with until the point where, of course, they have to intervene themselves. Keep cuttings on recent stories and even stories going back a few years, because journalists have a nasty habit of using stories from the past, even where you don't think they're relevant in a crisis situation, and that can derail even the most carefully constructed statements. Consider media training for your key people so that there's always someone to respond to interviews. This is particularly important throughout any stage of a crisis, but especially so, I would say, in the key stages. Could your CEO produce a film? That's another key tool to keep you ahead of the game in the social media age, a short, effective statement. Make sure everything is watertight. Look to those employees, keep them informed, but tell them not to respond to inquiries from individual journalists who may circumvent the company's website and the press office and find their details on social media, even LinkedIn, and approach them directly. Very tempting for any employee to speak, because who doesn't like their 5 minutes of fame? Control the flow of information and respond appropriately. If a crisis breaks on Facebook, respond there first. But I would recommend using a statement that can be used across all media platforms, something short and concise that you can use for a tweet, that you can use for a short post on Facebook, that you can then develop into a press release. Information is key, but you need to keep the flow of it going, and you need to be transparent. Little and often is important, and not being trapped into saying more than you are comfortable with saying. And even though it's still a crisis, you can still include those positive messages about your organization, what you've done in the past, and how you're going to deal with the situation. In the Malaysian Airlines crisis, when the plane went missing, there wasn't much to say. But the airline was faced with the situation of the news agenda being dictated by some extent by the Malaysian government, and also further complicated by the 26 countries that became involved in the search for the missing plane. So they therefore became forced to be on a treadmill of news. Be prepared for journalists to take this crisis further and to turn up at your offices. And if that happens, you need to accommodate them as much as possible. Will you need to stage a press conference? Where will you hold this? Who will speak? All these things can be planned for in advance, can be written down, and can be prepared for to a large extent. Apologize, because you can never say sorry enough. Say you'll be investigating what went wrong, because you will be. Accountability is key, and place your customers above the corporation. And reassure. This is essential for customer confidence. What will be done and when? Say you're going to learn your lessons. Express compassion. Be human, honest, be transparent. An example of this is the supermarket giant Tesco, which this week announced a big drop in profits for the second year in a row. The CEO issued a strong statement, saying that customers were still at the heart of all they had to do, and they were going to move forward by responding to what they needed to do. It was simple, it was powerful, it was honest, and it was effective. So are you ready for any crisis that might engulf your organization? The things you need to do are work out a plan and then refine your plan. Think about what journalists will need and practice and practice. Journalists themselves actually practice quite a lot, unbeknown to anyone else. When I worked in television, we would often prepare for major news events, the deaths of leading politicians, where reporters would go on occasions like that, and the whole day would be taken up in this exercise. In radio, when it was a quiet day or even a quiet night, because it was a 24-hour news operation, we'd prepare obituaries of people and update them and refresh them. Journalists who were working on major court cases will write two scenarios. They'll write a scenario if the person is acquitted. They'll write a different one if the person is sent to prison. So there is a lot of preparation from journalists on their stories, but when they're dealing with your stories, then you need to provide them with what they need to know. Remember, you are the expert. You have the information at your fingertips. They are often coming to this cold. Think about what they need. Write as effectively as you can for them. Help them as much as possible. And respond to social media with the utmost professionalism at all times and try and contain the situation. And if you can't contain it, because that's the whole nature of crisis communications, at least come out of it with your dignity intact. In my work as a media trainer, I often work with PR agencies to develop these sorts of strategies, and this is a very effective way of helping companies because obviously the agencies know what's gone before and how we can address issues that might be arising. And I'm always happy to offer a 15-minute consultation free of charge to anyone who's interested in developing their crisis comms further or might be looking to engage in some media training.
Thank you very much, Kathryn. There were some really good examples there. Just one of the questions that first come to my mind is that, you mentioned in your slides that companies need to monitor their brand 24/7 on social media. I can understand if the big brands, the big, agents, the big, systems in order. But what about the smaller companies? Do you think like a marketing team of say one or two people wouldn't it be much tougher for them to have 24/7 monitoring of their brand?
Yes, of course, that would be much harder. But I think it's always good to have the details of someone who can help you in that situation on hand. And unless it's a really enormous crisis, unless you've got a big fire breaking out in the company, many of the issues that are affecting smaller companies won't, in fact, happen over the weekend. So you can deal with them on the Monday morning. And in fact, you can often keep things at bay during that time by just issuing short statements. But obviously you would have to deal with it, and it is important that somebody, although I hesitate to advise anybody having to be looking at emails 7 days a week and their days off, but it is advisable to sort of check in, particularly if you know that something's brewing, and so you can see what's happening. Do we need to take action on this? Can it wait until first thing on Monday morning? But yes, it is tough. But it's knowing really when to call in the experts. And I think if you've got a plan in place, you will feel more comfortable with doing that. You will know where to go to, and you'll save yourself time above all else.
Okay. And what about CEOs? Especially for PRs, I think this might be a bit tricky when a crisis is taking place and the CEOs decide to take communication in their own hand and decide to say, okay, we're going to announce a few things on Twitter. What can PRs do to sort of make sure the chain of command is followed? And should CEOs tweet?
I don't think CEOs should ever tweet unaided, as it were. They must always work in conjunction with a lawyer. That's absolutely vital, because I think people still don't realise the legal implications of what you put out on social media, and it is the same as publishing anything anywhere else. And they should work with the PR. And I think it's very worrying if a CEO would sort of go on a solo mission on something like this. This is where your practice and your preparation come in, so that the CEO would sort of realise the importance of it, of making sure that you were working as part of a closely knit team and tightly controlling your flow of information. So this is where you need to start. Sitting down, taking everybody out of the office if needs be, sitting down, having the luxury of a day away from your usual business and just thinking about all the things that could happen and working out who would be speaking, and the logistics, and the comments, and all those key statements that you need to be putting out about your company. And the crisis that you're preparing for, very unlikely to be the one that actually happens, but at least when something does hit, you'll be in the right frame of mind to address it without going into a panic mode.
Right, right. Great. There's some questions coming in, Kathryn. One is from Wendy. She asks, some individuals refuse to discuss their issue offline. How do you deal with that?
Sorry, some individuals refuse to address their issue? What was that?
Some individuals refuse to discuss their issue offline. How do you deal with that? I think what she means is that, some people prefer to sort of just, yeah.
Well, I think you should always try. So, I mean, if somebody's made a complaint online and then you respond in a sort of dignified and appropriate way, and then after that they come back, then you try and take it offline. If they refuse to do that, you must never get involved in a war of words online. It can only be damaging. I think things like TripAdvisor is a good example. If you're talking about so often small cafes feel the need to respond to every comment that's made about, the staleness of their scones or the fact that their coffee was a bit cold. And you can lose a lot of credibility even in small business by continuing having this ping-pong of information between you and the person making the complaint. So you should always try and address it, but where possible. But if the comments continue, there has to be a point where you withdraw, where you decline, because by continuing with this sort of argument online, you are in fact only heightening your problems. I mean, some of the big hotel chains, and I work as a PR for a large hotel chain, they don't always respond to TripAdvisor comments. They only talk about things in general and particularly good ones. And of course, a lot of these comments are very badly spelled and very badly put together. So you can often have a different line of attack whereby you come on and say, if you can't put your comment accurately or not quite in those words, then perhaps you're not really eligible to engage in public discourse. So there are ways of dealing with it, but never get into a war of words online. It just never ends well, and it won't end well for you, I don't think.
Okay. Do you think has social media made managing a crisis easier or harder?
I think it's made it unquestionably much harder because the agenda is so fast now, and things happen, on social media and then news stories instantaneously, whereas previously you had control about what you were going to say and when, and now other people are setting that agenda for you.
Right.
Even if it's a road accident, the pictures that come first from the scene will be shot on a mobile phone, and they will be sent in. They're not necessarily, they're not going to be necessarily requested by a journalist, but they will be in there and they'll be on the news, within a matter of hours. So it's very difficult to control what's going on in any sense. So you have to be able to respond quickly, and being able to say something, no matter how brief, is a skill that you can only really get through practicing, and because it is daunting. It is daunting talking to a radio reporter. It is even more daunting being on the television. But if you can get somebody who's trained and comfortable doing that, the reassurance value of that alone is immense.
Right. There's another question here. It says, how do you suggest a public sector organization should deal with a potential crisis on social media? Is it any different?
It'll always be different because of the public sector. You have to make sure that whatever you're saying is compliant. But it's worth doing your own exercise even within the umbrella of being a public organisation, because you can liaise with your main press office and make sure that you are relaying those important messages that they would want to contain. But at least then you've got somebody else to help you deal with in the public sector. So it's really getting all those contacts in place. It's almost like a housekeeping exercise of what support will we call upon, who would deal with what at what particular stage of the crisis. So there is quite a lot of reassurance in that situation. But yes, with the public sector, you always need to make sure that it's compliant with their main press office, and also with of course the stakeholders involved. So that's a bit more of a lengthy process, really, inevitably, I think.
Yeah. This is a very interesting one from Linda. If you were head of comms at Volkswagen, how would you recommend they deal with the current crisis?
I think Volkswagen, and I say this from personal point of view, as much as a Volkswagen customer, I've been rather surprised by the lack of customer information to me here as a Volkswagen car owner in the UK. I would have expected and hoped on a personal level that more information was set up. So I'm not sure why the dealers in the UK haven't contacted their customers. I haven't found up until a couple of days ago when the head of Volkswagen announced the timetable for the recall of the affected vehicles, I haven't found a lot of information there about myself as a customer. So I would have suggested that Volkswagen in the UK and in every other country they're involved with had put up much earlier a dedicated website for customers so that they could see, is my vehicle affected? What are the likely implications going to be? What's the schedule for recall? That, to me, from a personal point of view, has taken too long almost to complete. It's 2 weeks, I think, before they've even started to announce the schedule of when they're going to recall the affected vehicles. I would have liked to have seen a website put up, and I think as if I had been their head of comms, I would have focused on the customers. What are they going to be saying? What information do they need? Can we get them up a website? Is there a free phone number they can call? What are the individual dealers saying? You know, the dealers I've heard of locally have been sending out discounts on new cars, but not addressing the fact that you already have a Volkswagen, which may have this problem and may have, of course, depreciated dramatically in value from when you bought it. So those sorts of information, I think, should have been put out much earlier, and perhaps I think, you know, a little bit more of who actually did this, who was responsible, and what are they doing to find, you know, within Volkswagen to find out how this happened, and how are those individuals or departments going to be brought to account. So I think those sorts of elements I would have incorporated in the Volkswagen response had I been in that position. And an enviable position, of course.
Absolutely. Another question from Alexandra. Is saying the wrong thing more damaging than saying nothing?
I think you always have to say something, and saying no comment is the worst thing you can say in any situation. It always has been, it always will be. There are always things that you can say in a crisis. It doesn't have to be complicated, it just has to be honest. So, you know, as long as you're speaking from the heart, with sincerity, with transparency, I don't see that unless you are deliberately being misleading, how you can ever really say the wrong thing. All you can do is acknowledge what's happened. This is the situation. We accept it's happened. We're looking into it. Often that is enough of a statement to maintain your credibility in the face of a crisis. So it's really acknowledging, investigating. We're going to find out, because even if you don't know anything, you're going to know within a few days. So it's setting out that timetable of information. This is what's happened. We acknowledge it. We accept it. We'll find out what's happened. And as soon as we know more, we'll tell you. That's often all you need to say. So there's no question of being dishonest in any of that, because as long as you stick to the facts and relay them in a simple, effective manner, then that will be reported, and that will maintain your credibility as an organisation.
Great. I think we have time for one more question. This is from Kathryn. She asks, what can you do if an individual journalist takes up against you, perhaps because you didn't give them what they wanted, and goes on a rant on Twitter?
Well, the answer is you can only fight fire with fire, but you have to do it again in this very dignified response. I don't think you can respond to everything a journalist says. I think you almost have to group together their comments, take it as a theme, take it as one story, and produce perhaps in that instance one robust response when you have something that you can really try and dispel the story with. So it's almost as if you're waiting for the story to be overtaken. If it's factually incorrect, then obviously you must take legal action. You know, if they really are, there's no basis for their allegations, then you must take legal action, and that will shut things down pretty quickly, I would suggest. But there are always going to be journalists who have an agenda. There are always going to be negative comments from them across the board. But of course, on Twitter, it really is a constantly moving thing. It's a free flow of invective almost, which is very difficult once it starts silence. Often you have to wait, get it to wait its course, and just, as I say, one robust sort of comment, and then try and move it on to something else. Try and, maybe even court them with another story, or offer them an exclusive in some way if you've got something that you can try and tempt them out of their current rant with. So it's just being constructive and trying not to take anything that they may say about you personally.
Great. Fantastic. Thank you. I think that's all the time we have for questions right now, but we will, if that's okay with you, Kathryn, answer the rest that have come in a blog post.
Yes, that's fine.
Yeah? Okay, great. Thank you once again, Kathryn, and thank you all that have attended our webinar today. We do hope that you found it useful. Thanks also to John, Imogen, and Paul for their help with the webinar production. Hope to see you all again next month at our next webinar. Thanks. Bye.